Okay, so in our previous videos, we had been focusing a lot on Egypt, but I want to talk about the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. So we talked about how they have the three-age system with the Stone Age, the Iron Age, and the Bronze Age. And within that, we can divide the Bronze Age into three periods as well. We have the early, the middle, and the late, with the early period being from 3300 to 2100 BC, the middle being approximately 2100 to 1550 BC, and the late being about 1550 to 1200 or 1177 BC, with the Bronze Age collapse. And then, of course, it depends on the region for when they developed Bronze Age technology, and even this could be said of history as well. So, when we have writing, it develops early in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians, giving us the historical record to go off of. Whereas in like North America, they didn't have writing until the Europeans arrived. And this is true for the Bronze Age as well. So we have the Bronze Age beginning around 3000 or before 3000 BC in Greece and China, and then around 1900 in Britain, and it just depended on the time period as far as when they developed bronze, which is, of course, an alloy of copper and tin. Speaking of Britain, there is an English archaeologist or a British archaeologist by the name of James Rich, who was looking at the hieroglyphics in Babylon and Nineveh. But it wasn't just Babylon and Nineveh. There were also hieroglyphics in Persian sites like Persepolis, of course, which is the capital, but also Behistun, which is another important city in Persia. And they've discovered three languages, and these three languages were Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. So this was almost kind of like a Rosetta Stone of sorts. A lot of things were written in all three languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. It's not nearly as famous as the Rosetta Stone, but it's almost just as important, if not even more so. Um, so when we speak of Akkadian, actually, Akkadian was both a kingdom but also a language, and it was a Semitic language, which is similar to like modern Arabic. So the Akkadians, they were centered on the city of Akkad, and it is often referred to as the First Empire, with 2334 being the foundation by Sargon of Akkad, who died in around 2279 BC, and he conquered the Sumerian city-states, becoming the first king of Samaria and Akkad. You'll see this oftentimes where they call him the king of Samaria and Akkad, or also even back then some of the writings refer to him as the king of the universe. So that's a pretty lofty title. So the early period is dominated by, of course, the Sumerians, and then later the Akkadians, and as well as the Akkadians and the Elamites too. The Elamites were a pre-Iranian peoples in what would eventually become Iran. And then we have the Sumerians. Now, the Sumerians are what I like to call a parent civilization or a mother civilization. Some people would refer to it as, meaning they would have a huge influence on religion, art, uh, a lot of the culture of the later kingdoms like Assyria and Babylon and other kingdoms of the Mesopotamia. Obviously, we mentioned technology as well. The Sumerians had a huge impact on technology and science for the region and even for the world. When we speak of the Sumerians, though, we mentioned how the Akkadians are sometimes referred to as the first empire, but the Sumerians were a group of city states with um, various city states like Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Eridu, just to name a few of the important ones. As we get into the Middle and the Late Bronze Age, we see a new host of empires rising and falling that would become important, such as the Babylonians and the Assyrians, as well as the Hittites, the Mitanni, and other smaller factions as well. Um, it's important to note that sometimes these nations or empires would rise and fall and then kind of rise again, and a lot of times they were existing at the same time. So a lot of times Babylon and Assyria would exist around the same time. So speaking of Babylon, Babylon would become important culturally. Um, when we think of the Ishtar Gate, a lot of the things that we think of with Babylon, like the Ishtar Gate and different things, are from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, as well as like the Hanging Gardens. But during ancient times, we have Hammurabi, who reigned from approximately 1792, and he's most famous for his law codes, but he also conquered the Mari people, who were his former allies, and he also, for a time, conquered the Assyrians, installing a puppet king in Assyria. And for a long time, you had the um, Babylonians in the south, and then you had the Mitanni and the Hittites to the north. Eventually, Assyria would rise again, and Assyria would end up conquering the Mitanni peoples, and also the Assyrians would eventually uh, get the upper hand on the Hittites as well in a not very famous battle, but one that should be more famous than it is, and that's the Battle of Neriah in 1243 BC. That really changed the dynamic in the region. Now, when we talk about both the Hittites and the Assyrians, they're both a very warlike people. I hesitate to use the term cruel, but even by the standards of the time, they probably would have been perceived that way. They're certainly written about that way in the Bible, and uh, they would have been seen that way by, of course, the other people around them as well. Um, Now, when we look at history, it's important to note that ideas of right and wrong, we leave that to the moral philosophers. And as history, when we look at history, historians, we want to not ask questions of is it right or wrong or good or bad, but we want to look at the civilization, we want to look at what's going on, and we want to look at why things were the way that they were. But when we talk about both the Assyrians and the Hittites, they were both certainly a very warlike people, a very militaristic group, and they were perceived as being cruel to the people around them. Certainly perceived them in that way. Geographically, both the Babylonians and the Syrians would have been in between the Tigris and the Euphrates, whereas the Hittites were mostly in present-day Turkey, but as well they stretched into the Levant a little bit. So with that, that brings us basically to the end of the Bronze Age and it sets the stage for what would become the Bronze Age collapse, which we'll look at. And we also want to talk briefly about Greece. Now, I know we're focused on the history of the Middle East, but history doesn't happen in a vacuum, and Greece would be very important historically, and they had a lot of contact with, of course, the Egyptians and the other people of Mesopotamia, and so we'll be touching on them, and we'll be looking at the Bronze Age collapse. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for your time.